You have been the same person for too long. How to break free from the version of you that is holding you back. Introduction. Here is a question most people never stop long enough to actually answer. When was the last time you did something that surprised you? Not something that impressed other people. Not something that looked good from the outside. Something that genuinely caught you off guard. A decision you made, a direction you took, a version of yourself that showed up and made you think, I did not know I had that in me. Take a moment with that. Because for a lot of people, the honest answer is, they cannot remember. And that is not a small thing. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you are working or how little you are sleeping. It is the exhaustion of performing a version of yourself you have quietly outgrown. It is the weight of maintaining a life that fits you the way an old coat fits. Not terribly, not unwearably, but wrong in the shoulders. Tight in places it never used to be. A little too familiar, a little too small, and worn long past the point it should have been replaced. Most people in that position do not call it what it is. They call it stress. They call it burnout. They call it a rough season. They tell themselves that everyone feels this way, that this is just what adult life looks like, that the discomfort is the price of responsibility. And then they get back to managing the life they have built, not because it is the life they want, but because they have been living it long enough that they have forgotten there was ever supposed to be a choice. This book is not for people who are in crisis. It is for people who are not, and that is the problem. It is for the person who is functional, capable, and respected by everyone around them, and who lies awake at 3 in the morning with a feeling they cannot fully explain. Not grief, not panic, something quieter than that. A low hum of wrongness. A sense that somewhere along the way, without meaning to, they became the supporting character in their own story. It is for the person who keeps reading books like this one, highlights the good parts, feels genuinely moved, and then wakes up 6 months later having changed absolutely nothing. Not because they lacked the desire, because they never understood what actually needed to change. And it is for the person who has already tried, who has set the goals, built the habits, done the journaling, announced the fresh starts, and watched every single attempt quietly collapse back into the same version of the same life. Not from laziness, not from weakness, from something much more specific and much more fixable than either of those. What you are about to read is not motivational. Motivation is everywhere, and it is cheap. You do not need to feel more inspired. You need to understand something, clearly, practically, and without illusion, about how identity works, why change fails, and what it actually takes to become someone genuinely different from the person you have been. Each chapter ends with 3 actions, not suggestions, not ideas to consider. Actions, specific, direct, and designed to be used. If you are reading this as a book, write in the margins. If you are listening, keep something close to write with. The chapters are the map. The actions are the movement. Because here is the most uncomfortable truth this book will ask you to sit with, and it might as well come first. You are not stuck because life has been hard. You are not stuck because you lack talent, or time, or the right opportunity. You are stuck because you have been the same person for too long, and some part of you has started to believe that is simply who you are. It is not. Let's begin. Chapter 1. You have outgrown your own life, and you have been calling it a problem. There is a moment, and if you are honest with yourself, you will know exactly what it feels like when you realize that the life you are living no longer quite fits the person you have become. It does not arrive as a dramatic breakdown. It rarely announces itself cleanly. It shows up instead as a series of small, easy-to-dismiss signals. A Sunday evening that feels heavier than it should. A conversation you have had so many times you can predict every word before it is spoken. A goal you wrote down once, and then again the following year, and then again the year after that. Same goal, same handwriting, same quiet sense of defeat when you find the old version and realize nothing has moved. Most people, when they feel this, do not think, I have grown beyond this. They think, what is wrong with me? That is the first mistake, and it costs more than most people ever calculate. What the signal actually means. Growth is not always loud. It does not always look like achievement or momentum or visible progress. Sometimes growth is simply the internal expansion of a person, a widening of what they understand, what they want, what they know themselves to be capable of, that quietly outpaces the external life built to contain it. Think of it this way. When you were 22, a certain kind of life made complete sense. The apartment, the social circle, the job that paid enough to get by, the version of ambition that fit inside the life you could imagine at the time. It was not a bad life. It was a perfectly reasonable life for the person you were then. But you are not that person anymore. You have lived things since then. You have failed and recovered and learned things that cannot be unlearned. You have sat with enough silence to start hearing yourself think. And somewhere in that process, gradually, without ceremony, you became someone whose needs, whose values, whose sense of what is possible has moved significantly past the life that was built for an earlier version of you. That gap between who you have become and the life still shaped around who you were is not a crisis. It is evidence. It is the feeling of a person who has genuinely grown pressing up against the walls of a container that has not grown with them. The signal is not, something is wrong with you. The signal is, something is ready to change. Why we misread it? The problem is that human beings are not naturally good at sitting with unexplained discomfort. We are problem solvers by design. When something feels wrong, we look for the problem, and we look for it in the most available place, which is almost always ourselves. So the person who has outgrown their career does not think, this role no longer fits who I am. They think, I am not working hard enough. I am not grateful enough. I need to push through, be better, want less. The person who has outgrown a relationship does not think, we have grown in different directions. They think, I am being selfish. I am chasing something that does not exist. I should be satisfied with what I have. The person who has outgrown their own self-image, the story they tell about what they are capable of, what they deserve, who they are allowed to become, does not think, that story is outdated. They think, this is just who I am. This is the ceiling. Learn to live with it. Every one of those responses takes a growth signal and converts it into a personal failure. And once you have decided the feeling is a failure, you stop reading it as information. You start managing it instead, suppressing it, explaining it away, medicating it with distraction, staying busy enough that you never have to sit with it long enough to understand what it is actually telling you. This is how years pass. The familiarity trap. Here is where it gets more complicated and more honest. Even when people correctly identify that something no longer fits, most of them do not change it. And the reason is not laziness, and it is not fear in the way we usually talk about fear. The reason is something more specific. The brain cannot reliably distinguish between familiar and safe. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological fact. The brain's primary directive is threat detection, and it uses pattern recognition to do that job. Familiar patterns register as low threat. Unfamiliar patterns, regardless of whether they are actually dangerous, register as something to approach with caution, to resist, to avoid. What this means in practical terms is that your nervous system will defend the life you have, even a life that is making you miserable, simply because it knows it. The misery is familiar. The misery has a shape, a rhythm, a predictable texture. And the brain, doing exactly the job it was designed to do, will choose known suffering over unknown possibility almost every time. This is why people stay in jobs they hate for a decade. Not because they cannot leave, because leaving feels, at a physical, pre-rational level, more dangerous than staying. Not more difficult, more dangerous. The body responds to the unfamiliar with the same low-grade alarm it uses for genuine threat. Understanding this does not eliminate the pull toward familiarity, but it changes what you call it. It stops being I am comfortable here and starts being I am familiar here. And those are not the same thing. Comfortable means it is working. Familiar means it is known. A cage can be familiar. An unhealthy relationship can be familiar. A diminished version of yourself can be so familiar that it feels like the only true version, when in reality, it is simply the version you have rehearsed the longest. The cost of one more year. There is a question worth asking that most people actively avoid because the answer is too uncomfortable to look at directly. What does one more year of the same actually cost you? Not in dramatic terms. Specifically, if you spend one more year in the same role, telling yourself the same story, maintaining the same habits, moving through the same routines, what does that year produce? What does it close off? What version of yourself becomes slightly less possible with each month that passes? This is not a question designed to create panic. It is a question designed to make the cost of staying as visible as the cost of changing. Because right now, the cost of changing feels enormous and real and immediate. The cost of staying feels like nothing, like simply continuing, like the neutral default. It is not neutral. Staying is a decision. Every day you inhabit a life you have outgrown is a day you are actively choosing it. And that choice, made quietly and repeatedly over months and years, has a cumulative cost that rarely gets calculated honestly. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that you have grown enough to feel the walls. That is not a problem to solve. That is a beginning to recognize. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. Write your "this no longer fits" list. Set a timer for 10 minutes. Write without editing. List every area of your life: work, relationships, daily habits, self-image, goals, environments, where something feels tight, wrong, or quietly exhausting in a way you have been explaining away. Do not justify any item. Do not solve any item. Simply name them. The list itself is the first act of honesty this process requires. Action 2. Calculate the cost of one more year. Pick the one item from your list that carries the most weight. Now write, specifically, not generally, what one more year of that unchanged reality costs you. What does it cost in energy, in possibility, in the version of yourself that becomes slightly less available with each passing month? Make the cost visible. Vague discomfort is easy to ignore. A specific cost is harder to look away from. Action 3. Find the last time you surprised yourself. Think back, as far as you need to the last time you did something that genuinely surprised you. A decision, an action, a moment where a version of yourself showed up that you did not fully expect. Write down what that felt like. Write down what made it possible. That moment is evidence of range you already possess. You are not starting from nothing. You are returning to something. Chapter 2. Your identity is not who you are. It is what you got used to and why that matters. Ask someone who they are, and they will almost always tell you what they do, what they have been through, or what they are like, as if those 3 things together add up to a complete and accurate picture of a person. I am someone who is not good with money. I am not the kind of person who takes risks. I am practical, realistic, grounded. I have always been this way. Listen carefully when people describe themselves, and you will notice something. Almost nobody speaks about their identity as something that was built. They speak about it as something that was discovered, as if they were simply excavated from the earth fully formed, and all that living was just the process of uncovering what was already there. That story is comfortable. It is also almost entirely false. How identity actually gets built. Identity is not discovered. It is accumulated. It is built the way sediment builds, slowly, in layers, mostly without your awareness or consent. A comment made by a parent when you were 9 years old. The way your first significant failure was handled, by you, and by the people around you. The social group you fell into at 16, the unspoken rules of that group, the version of yourself you performed to belong to it. The relationship that told you what kind of partner you were. The job that told you what kind of worker you were. The repeated experiences that told you, again and again, what you could expect from the world and from yourself. None of that was chosen. All of it was absorbed. And here is the part that matters most. The brain does not store these accumulated experiences as memories of things that happened. It stores them as facts about who you are. The conclusion gets filed, and the original evidence gets forgotten. So by the time you are an adult, walking around with a fully formed sense of self, most of what feels like "this is who I am" is actually a collection of conclusions drawn from experiences you no longer consciously remember drawing them from. You do not remember deciding you were not creative. You just know, somehow, that you are not. You do not remember deciding that success was for other kinds of people. You just feel, somehow, that reaching for it is a little embarrassing, a little naive, a little more than you are supposed to want. That feeling is not insight. It is inheritance. The chosen self versus the inherited self. There is a meaningful difference between an identity you have chosen and an identity you have simply not questioned. Most people are living the second kind. The inherited self is built from other people's reactions, other people's expectations, the environments you happen to be placed in before you were old enough to choose your environments. It is not malicious. Nobody designed it. It assembled itself from available materials, and the available materials, especially in childhood and early adulthood, were largely outside your control. The chosen self is something different. It is what becomes possible when you stop treating your accumulated conclusions as permanent facts and start examining them the way you would examine any other piece of information, asking where it came from, whether it still holds, whether it was ever actually true or simply repeated often enough to feel that way. Most people never do this, not because they are incapable of it, but because the inherited self is so deeply familiar that it does not feel like an identity at all. It feels like reality. It feels like the ground beneath your feet rather than a set of ideas about yourself that you have been standing on for so long you forgot they were ideas. The moment you can see your identity as constructed, as something built rather than discovered, is the moment you realize it can be rebuilt. Not abandoned overnight, not magically replaced, but deliberately and systematically reconstructed by someone who is finally participating in the process. Why behavior change without identity change always fails. This is where most change attempts quietly break down, and it is worth being precise about why. The standard approach to change is behavioral. You decide what you want to do differently. You build a system around that behavior. You motivate yourself to follow through, and you hope the results eventually show up and keep you going. Sometimes it works for a week, sometimes a month. Occasionally, if conditions are perfect and motivation stays high, a little longer. But most of the time, it collapses. And when it does, people blame discipline. They blame consistency. They blame themselves for not wanting it badly enough. The diagnosis is wrong. The reason behavioral change fails is not lack of effort. It is identity conflict. When your actions are out of alignment with your identity, with the deep, mostly unconscious story you carry about who you are, your identity wins. Every time, not through conscious resistance, but through the thousand small daily decisions that quietly accumulate back toward the familiar self. You can decide to become someone who exercises every morning. But if your identity, the story running underneath, is I am someone who is not disciplined, who is not an athlete, who does not prioritize themselves, then every morning becomes a negotiation between the behavior you chose and the identity that predates it. And after enough mornings of that negotiation, the behavior loses. Not because you are weak, because you were trying to act like someone you had not yet become. The solution is not more discipline. The solution is to change who you believe you are, first, before the behavior, and then let the behavior follow from the identity rather than fight against it. This is the identity-first approach, and it is almost the opposite of how most people try to change. What identity-first change actually looks like. The shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Instead of asking, what do I need to do differently, the identity-first question is, who is the person I am becoming? And what does that person naturally do? It is not a trick. It is a genuine reorientation. Because when you start from identity, when you decide, with real commitment, that you are becoming a specific kind of person, your daily decisions stop being acts of discipline and start being acts of consistency. You are not forcing yourself to behave contrary to who you are. You are simply acting in alignment with who you have decided to become. The behaviors do not change first. The story changes first. And then the behaviors follow, not as effort, but as expression. This requires something most change advice never asks for: genuine examination of the identity you are currently living. Not surface level, the deep version. The beliefs about yourself that feel so obvious you have never thought to question them. The conclusions you drew about your capabilities, your worth, your range, and where, honestly, those conclusions actually came from. Because once you can see that an identity was built, you can build a different one. Not a fantasy version, not a performance of someone you admire. A deliberate, evidence-based construction of the person you are actually in the process of becoming. Starting now, before the results show up, before anyone else can see it, before you feel ready. The old identity will resist. That is expected. That is part of the process, not evidence that the process is failing. What matters is which story you decide to keep telling. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. Write your current identity statement as if describing a stranger in third person. Write a paragraph describing who you currently are, your patterns, your tendencies, your default responses, your beliefs about yourself, and what you are capable of. Write it as if you are describing someone you have observed closely but are not emotionally attached to. This distance is intentional. It creates enough space between you and the description to actually see it, rather than simply inhabit it. Action 2. Identify 3 beliefs about yourself that were given to you, not chosen. Look at the identity you just wrote. Now ask, for each element, where did this actually come from? Who told me this? Or what experience taught me this? And did I ever consciously decide it was true? Find 3 specific beliefs about your capabilities, your limitations, your worth, your potential that you did not choose, that were handed to you by circumstance, by other people, by an environment you were placed in before you knew you could push back. Write down where each one came from. Action 3. Write the identity of the person you are becoming in present tense, not who you want to be one day. Who you are becoming now. Write it in present tense, in first person, with specificity. Not I want to be confident, but I am someone who acts before I feel ready and trusts the outcome to follow. Not I hope to become disciplined, but I am someone who keeps commitments to myself the way I keep commitments to people I respect. Write the full identity of the next version of you. This is not a wish list. It is a blueprint. The brain needs a specific target. Give it one. Chapter 3. The people around you need you to stay the same. There is a conversation that happens in almost every genuine reinvention, and nobody warns you about it in advance. It does not happen with strangers. It does not happen with people who dislike you. It happens with the people closest to you, the ones who have known you longest, who love you most genuinely, who would, if asked, say without hesitation that they want the best for you. The conversation goes something like this. You share something you are working toward, a change you are making, a direction you are moving in, a version of yourself you are building. And instead of the enthusiasm you expected, you get something cooler. A hesitation. A gentle skepticism dressed up as concern. Are you sure that is realistic? You have tried things like this before. I just do not want to see you get hurt. I am only saying this because I care about you. And here is what makes it so difficult to navigate. They are not lying. They probably do care about you. The problem is that caring about someone and needing them to stay the same are not mutually exclusive, and most people in your life are doing both simultaneously, without being fully aware of either. The invisible social contract. Every relationship operates on an unspoken agreement about who each person is. Not a conscious agreement. Nobody sits down and negotiates it. But over time, through repetition and shared experience, every relationship develops a set of expectations. You are the reliable one, or the funny one, or the one who always needs advice, or the one who gives it. You are the person who plays it safe, or the one who is always starting something new and never finishing it. You are the ambitious one, or the content one, or the one who struggles. These roles are not assigned maliciously. They emerge naturally from years of interaction. But once they are established, they become load-bearing walls in the structure of the relationship. And when you start to change, genuinely, substantively change, you are not just changing yourself. You are altering the architecture that the people around you have been leaning against. This is why the resistance from people who love you is not really about you. It is about the disruption your change creates in the system they have organized themselves around. If you become more ambitious, what does that say about their own ambitions? If you start prioritizing yourself, what happens to the dynamic where you were always available? If you grow in confidence, does the person who has always been slightly ahead of you in that area feel the ground shift beneath them? None of this is conscious. Almost none of it is intentional. But it is real, and it is powerful, and if you do not understand it, you will spend enormous energy trying to convince the wrong people and interpreting their resistance as evidence that you are wrong. The difference between celebration and threat. Not everyone in your life will respond to your growth the same way. And the difference is worth understanding clearly, because it determines who you go to for support and who you learn to stop seeking approval from. Some people in your life are genuinely expansive. When you share a change you are making, they lean forward. They ask questions that push you further rather than questions designed to introduce doubt. Their enthusiasm is not performative. It is because your growth does not cost them anything. It does not reposition them. It does not require them to look at their own life through a different lens. These people are rare, and they are worth identifying because they are the ones you bring your half-formed ideas to. They are safe containers for the version of you that is not yet fully built. Other people, and this category is larger than most people want to admit, respond to your growth as a mild or not so mild threat. Again, not consciously. The mechanism is subtler than that. They simply feel, without being able to articulate why, that something is being disrupted. And so they push back. They reframe your ambition as arrogance, your boundary setting as selfishness, your momentum as instability. They remind you of the times you tried before and it did not work. They ask careful questions designed not to open possibilities, but to close them. The distinction is not about who loves you more. It is about who has enough security in themselves to celebrate your expansion without feeling diminished by it. That is a quality of the other person's relationship with themselves, not a measure of how much they care about you. This is not about cutting people off. Here is where this conversation usually goes wrong, and it is worth addressing directly. Understanding that the people around you have a stake in your staying the same does not mean those people are bad for you. It does not mean the relationships are toxic. It does not mean you need to end them or distance yourself dramatically or deliver a speech about your personal growth journey. What it means is this: you need to stop seeking certain things from certain people. Specifically, you need to stop seeking validation for your change from the people who are most invested in your staying the same. Not because they are bad people, because they are structurally unable to give you what you are asking for. Asking your most risk-averse friend to affirm your boldest decision is like asking someone who is afraid of water to tell you the ocean is safe. Their fear is real. Their answer will reflect their fear. And neither of those things has anything to do with whether the ocean is actually safe. The practical shift is this: you learn to give different things to different people. The people who knew the old you. You love them. You maintain the relationship. You do not require them to be something they are not. And separately, you find and cultivate the people who know the version of you that is becoming. Not as a replacement, as an addition, as the scaffolding that holds the new construction while the old materials adjust, or do not. The person who is already there. There is one more thing worth saying in this chapter, and it is perhaps the most practical. If you want to understand what is possible for you, what the next version of your life actually looks like from the inside, the fastest way to get that information is not from a book. It is from a person who is already living it. Not a celebrity, not an abstract success story. Someone real, someone accessible, someone whose life contains elements of what you are building toward. Someone you can observe not just in their highlight moments, but in their ordinary decisions. How they think about setbacks, how they structure their time, what they prioritize when nobody is watching. The reason this matters is not inspiration. Inspiration fades. The reason is identity modeling. When you spend sustained time around someone who is already operating from the identity you are building, your brain begins to normalize that identity. What once felt exceptional starts to feel possible. What felt like a reach starts to feel like a direction. The people around you are not just relationships. They are, whether you are conscious of it or not, the primary evidence your brain uses to determine what is normal, what is possible, and what kind of person you are. Choose that evidence deliberately. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. Audit your 5 closest relationships honestly. Write down the 5 people you spend the most time with, or whose opinions carry the most weight in your daily decisions. For each one, answer 2 questions without softening the answers. Does this person actively support who I am becoming, or are they more comfortable with who I have been? And when I am around this person, do I feel expanded or contracted? This is not a verdict on the relationship. It is information about where you are currently getting your sense of what is normal and possible. Action 2. Identify which relationships are built on who you were. Look at your list again. Identify the relationships where the foundation, the reason for closeness, the dynamic that holds it together, is built primarily on a version of you that you are in the process of leaving behind. These relationships are not necessarily over, but they require honest attention. Because if the entire basis of a relationship is the old you, then becoming the new you will create friction, and you will need to decide, consciously, how to navigate that rather than being surprised by it when it arrives. Action 3. Find one person already living the life you want and study how they think. This does not require a personal introduction. It does not require access. It requires observation and intention. Identify one real, specific person, someone whose life contains elements of what you are building toward, and study them seriously. Not their results. Their thinking. How do they talk about setbacks? What do they prioritize? What do they seem unbothered by that you are currently consumed by? The goal is not imitation. It is calibration. You are looking for evidence of what is normal inside the identity you are building, so that identity starts to feel like a real place rather than a distant idea. Chapter 4. The story running in the background is writing your future. At some point today, before you picked up this book, you had a thought about yourself that you did not notice having. It was not dramatic. It did not feel significant. It may have lasted less than a second. a flash of internal commentary that ran underneath whatever you were doing, the way a river runs underneath a bridge. You probably did not stop to examine it. You almost certainly did not question it. It arrived, it registered, and it moved on, leaving behind a faint residue that shaped, in some small way, how you approached the next thing. This happens hundreds of times a day. And for most people, the content of those thoughts, the specific flavor of that internal commentary, has not changed substantially in years. That is not a small problem. That is the problem. The narrator you forgot was there. Every person carries an internal narrator, a voice, or more accurately, a constant stream of language that runs in the background of experience and provides a continuous interpretation of events. Not the events themselves, the meaning of the events. What they say about you, what they predict about your future, what they confirm about your worth, your capability, your place in the world. Most people, if asked to describe their internal narrator, would say something like, "That is just how I think. That is just my personality. That is just being realistic." What they are actually describing is a habit, a deeply grooved, heavily rehearsed, largely automatic habit of interpretation that was formed in response to early experiences and has been running, mostly unchallenged, ever since. The narrator is not your personality. It is not your instinct. It is not some deep truth about who you are emerging naturally from your authentic self. It is a script, written early, reinforced repeatedly, and mistaken for reality so consistently that it has become invisible, which is precisely what makes it so powerful. You cannot challenge what you cannot see. And most people cannot see their internal narrative because they are too busy living inside it. How a thought becomes a life. The mechanism by which a repeated thought shapes a lived reality is not mystical. It is behavioral and it is direct. A thought, repeated often enough, becomes an assumption. An assumption shapes perception, meaning you begin to notice evidence that confirms it and discount evidence that contradicts it. Perception shapes decision-making, meaning the choices available to you start to narrow around what the assumption says is realistic, safe, or appropriate for someone like you. Decision-making shapes behavior. Behavior shapes outcomes. And outcomes loop back and confirm the original thought. This is not a metaphor for how thinking works. This is the literal sequence. The person who carries the thought, "I am not someone people take seriously," does not experience it as a thought. They experience it as a fact, confirmed daily by the way they present themselves, the way they shrink in certain rooms, the opportunities they do not pursue because something in them already knows how it will go. And then, because the behavior produces outcomes consistent with the belief gets filed as accurate. The thought created the behavior. The behavior created the evidence. The evidence confirmed the thought. And the person, looking at their life, concludes, "See, this is just how things are for me." It is not how things are. It is how things have been reliably produced by a story that was never examined. The sentence that shaped 15 years. Consider someone like Marcus, a composite drawn from a pattern so common it barely needs inventing. Marcus was told at 14, by a teacher he respected enormously, that he was not a natural leader. The comment was not cruel. It was delivered almost offhandedly, in the context of a group project that had not gone well. The teacher had moved on before the sentence finished landing. Marcus did not move on. He did not consciously decide, in that moment, to carry the sentence forward. He did not write it down or repeat it deliberately. He simply absorbed it, the way a 14-year-old absorbs anything said by an adult they trust, and filed it under "things that are true about me." For the next 15 years, Marcus was competent, reliable, well-liked, and perpetually one step behind his own potential. He deferred in meetings where he had the clearest thinking in the room. He supported other people's initiatives rather than leading his own. When opportunities arose that required him to step forward visibly, he found reasons, always reasonable, always articulately justified, to step back instead. He was not lazy. He was not lacking in ability. He was living inside a single sentence spoken by someone who had forgotten saying it before Marcus had finished hearing it. The sentence was not true when it was said. It became true through 15 years of behavioral confirmation. And the most significant thing about it is not that it happened. It is that it was invisible to him until he stopped and looked directly at it. Your version of Marcus's sentence exists. It may be shorter or longer, louder or quieter, but it is there, and it is working. The difference between rewriting and pretending. When people hear the idea of changing their internal narrative, the instinct is often to reach for affirmations, positive statements repeated in the mirror, declarations of worthiness recited until they feel true. This does not work. Not because positive thinking is worthless, but because the brain is not fooled by statements that have no evidence attached to them. If your lived experience consistently contradicts the affirmation loses. The existing narrative, backed by years of behavioral confirmation, is simply more convincing than a sentence you started saying last Tuesday. The approach that actually works is different. It is not replacement through repetition. It is replacement through evidence. Instead of telling yourself, I am confident and capable when your history says otherwise, you find a specific, real, undeniable instance in which you were confident and capable. Not a fantasy, a memory, an actual moment when the quality you were trying to claim showed up in your real life. And you use that moment as the foundation of a new, evidence-based statement. Not I am fearless, but I have acted in the presence of fear before, and I can identify exactly when. Not I am a natural leader, but there are specific situations in which I have led well, and I can describe them. This approach works because it does not ask the brain to accept something unsupported. It asks the brain to reweight evidence it already has, to notice what it has been systematically discounting, and to build a more accurate story from material that was always there. You are not inventing a new self. You are correcting a narrative that was always undercounting you. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. Track your internal narrative for 1 full day without judgment from the moment you wake up tomorrow. Carry something to write with. Every time you notice an internal comment about yourself, your ability, your worth, your likelihood of success or failure, write it down without editing it. Do not challenge it yet. Do not soften it. Just catch it and record it. The goal of this action is visibility. You cannot work with what you cannot see, and most people have never actually looked at the raw content of their own internal commentary. 1 day of honest tracking will show you more about what is running your behavior than years of vague self-awareness. Action 2. Identify your 3 most repeated self-limiting sentences. Look at what you collected. Find the recurring ones, the thoughts that showed up more than once, or the ones that, even if they only appeared once, carried the most weight. Find the 3 that have the longest history. The ones you recognize not just from today, but from years ago. Write them down plainly. No softening, no context, no explanation. Just the sentence as it actually sounds inside your head. These 3 sentences are not personality traits. They are old scripts. Naming them precisely is the first step to retiring them. Action 3. Rewrite each one as a specific, evidence-based statement for each of the 3 sentences. Do not write an affirmation. Write a correction. Find real, specific evidence from your actual life that complicates or contradicts the limiting sentence. A moment, a result, a decision, a quality that was genuinely present even if it was not the dominant story. Build a new sentence from that evidence. Something your brain can actually accept because it is grounded in something that really happened. The new sentence does not need to be triumphant. It needs to be more accurate than the old one. Accuracy, not positivity, is what rewires a narrative. Chapter 5. What got you here is exactly what is keeping you there. There is a particular kind of stuck that does not look like stuck from the outside. It does not look like failure. It does not look like stagnation or lack of effort or absence of results. From the outside, and often from the inside too, it looks like success. A track record. A set of proven methods. A reliable approach to problems that has worked consistently enough to become the default setting for almost every situation encountered. This kind of stuck is the most difficult to diagnose because it is disguised as competence. And it is the most common trap for people who are genuinely capable. Because the more reliably something has worked, the more invisible it becomes as a potential obstacle. What got you here was real. What it cost you to develop it was real. And it will keep producing exactly what it has always produced. Which is precisely the problem, if what you are trying to produce is something different. The success trap. High achievers are particularly vulnerable to this, and it is worth being direct about why. When you have built a life through a specific combination of traits, say, relentless preparation, or the ability to outwork everyone in the room, or an instinct for playing it safe until the odds are overwhelmingly in your favor, those traits become more than strategies. They become identity. They become the story you tell about why you have succeeded. They become the lens through which you evaluate every new situation. And for a long time, that works. The traits that got you to a certain level are real strengths. They produced real results. The confidence you have in them is earned. But every strategy has a range. Every approach that is optimized for one kind of problem becomes a liability when the problem changes. And at some point, for almost everyone who is genuinely growing, the problem changes. The next chapter requires something different from what the last chapter rewarded. And the person who has spent years being validated for a particular way of operating finds themselves in the deeply uncomfortable position of being asked, by their own growth, to set down the tools that built everything they have. Most people cannot do it. Not because they lack the intelligence to see it. Because the identity investment is too high. Because letting go of what worked feels like admitting it was wrong. And it was not wrong. It was right for then. The shift required is not from wrong to right. It is from right for then to right for now. And that shift is harder than it sounds, because it requires a kind of humility that success does not naturally cultivate. How strength becomes ceiling. Think about someone like Diana, a pattern recognizable enough to be almost universal among people who have achieved something real and then found themselves inexplicably plateaued. Diana built her career on precision, on being the most prepared person in any room, on never presenting an idea before it was airtight, on delivering work that was thorough to the point of being unassailable. This served her extraordinarily well for the first decade of her professional life. She was trusted. She was promoted. She was the person leadership called when something needed to be done exactly right. And then she was passed over for a role she had clearly earned, by someone with a thinner portfolio but a more visible presence, a willingness to speak before everything was certain, an ease with uncertainty that Diana had always privately considered reckless. Diana's response, initially, was frustration, then analysis, then a doubling down on the very thing that had stopped working, as if the solution to precision not being enough was simply more precision. What she could not yet see was that the same quality that had made her indispensable at one level had made her invisible at the next. The thoroughness that signaled capability in a junior role signaled risk aversion in a senior one. The caution that produced excellent work also produced a leader who waited too long, consulted too much, and could not make a call without every variable accounted for. Her greatest strength had become her ceiling, not because it was a flaw, because she had never developed the capacity to put it down when the situation called for something it could not provide. The specific skill of letting go. Letting go of what worked is not the same as abandoning it. This distinction matters because most people, when they hear that their proven strategies may be holding them back, interpret that as an instruction to become someone unrecognizable, to throw out everything that made them effective and start from nothing. That is not the idea, and that kind of overcorrection is its own trap. The skill being described here is more surgical than that. It is the ability to hold your strategies loosely enough that you can choose when to use them rather than defaulting to them automatically in every situation. It is the difference between having a tool and being the tool. The person who has a hammer and also has other tools chooses the hammer when the situation calls for it. The person who has only ever used a hammer sees every problem as a nail, not out of stubbornness, but out of genuine inability to imagine a different approach. The question this chapter is asking you to sit with is not, what have I done wrong? It is, what have I done so consistently, for so long, that I can no longer clearly see when it is and is not the right approach? That question requires a specific kind of self-honesty that is different from the self-criticism most people are practiced at. Self-criticism asks, where have I failed? This question asks, where has my success itself become the obstacle? Those are not the same inquiry. And the second one is significantly harder to answer because it requires looking at your strengths with the same clear eyes you would use to look at your weaknesses. What the next chapter actually requires. Every genuine next chapter in a person's life requires at least one capability that the previous chapter did not reward, and often actively discouraged. The next chapter, after years of following instructions, requires the capacity to generate direction without being given one. The next chapter, after years of individual achievement, requires the capacity to create results through other people rather than despite them. The next chapter, after years of playing it safe, requires the capacity to move without certainty, to make a call before all the information is available, to act on judgment rather than proof. These are not skills that develop automatically. They develop through deliberate exposure to situations that require them, situations that the person who is over-relying on their existing toolkit will systematically avoid, because those situations are precisely the ones where their proven methods do not apply and their competence temporarily disappears. This temporary disappearance of competence is the price of the next chapter. It is the unavoidable feeling of being a beginner again at something that matters, of operating without the safety net of a track record, without the confidence that comes from having done this before and knowing how it goes. Most people pay the price of staying the same rather than pay that price. Not because staying is cheaper in any real sense, but because the cost of staying is spread thin and invisible across years, while the cost of changing arrives up front, in full, all at once. The next version of you will be built from capabilities you have not yet developed, which means there is a period, unavoidable and necessary, where you will be less impressive than you are used to being. That period is not failure. It is enrollment. It is the tuition for the next chapter, and there is no way to audit the course. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. List the 3 defining strategies of your current success. Write down the 3 approaches, traits, or methods that have most reliably produced results in your life so far. Be specific. Not "I work hard," but the particular flavor of how you work, the specific way you approach problems, the precise quality that people have consistently recognized and rewarded in you. These are real strengths. Name them with the respect they deserve, and then hold them lightly enough to examine them honestly in the next step. Action 2. Identify which ones are now working against your next chapter. For each of the 3 strategies, ask a single direct question. In the context of where I am trying to go, not where I have been, is this strategy still serving me, or is it now limiting me? Look for the places where your strength is producing safety instead of growth, thoroughness instead of momentum, familiarity instead of expansion. You are not looking for failures. You are looking for the specific ways that what once accelerated you is now, in certain contexts, functioning as a brake. Action 3. Name one thing the next version of you would do that the current version finds unnecessary or uncomfortable. This is the most revealing question in this chapter. Not what you should do, not what you know you ought to do. What would the next version of you, the one operating from the identity and capabilities required by your next chapter, do regularly, naturally, without resistance, that the current version avoids, delays, or finds a sophisticated reason to dismiss? Name it specifically. That thing is not optional for the next chapter. It is the price of admission. Chapter 6. The science of actually changing. What research says works. At some point in the process of trying to change, most people arrive at a version of the same conclusion, that they simply do not have what it takes. That other people, the ones who successfully reinvent themselves, who build new habits and sustain them, who become genuinely different from who they were, possess some quality that is either absent or present, and that they, despite repeated attempts, appear to be in the absent category. This conclusion feels like self-awareness. It is actually a misdiagnosis. The people who change successfully are not more disciplined, more motivated, or more psychologically equipped than the people who do not. What they have, in almost every documented case, is a better understanding of the conditions under which change actually occurs, and they have, whether consciously or accidentally, arranged their lives to meet those conditions. Change is not a character trait. It is a process. And like any process, it works reliably when the right conditions are present and fails reliably when they are not. The goal of this chapter is to make those conditions as clear and as practical as possible, so that what has felt like a mystery of willpower becomes, instead, a matter of design. What is actually happening in the brain? When you repeat a behavior, your brain does something physical in response. The neurons involved in that behavior fire together, and each time they do, the connection between them strengthens. Myelin, a fatty substance that insulates neural pathways, builds up around the most frequently used connections, making them faster, more automatic, more effortless. This is the biological basis of habit. The things you do repeatedly become, at a neurological level, the path of least resistance. This works in both directions. The behaviors and thought patterns you have been repeating for years, the ones that constitute the identity discussed in Chapter 2, are not just psychological habits. They are physical structures in your brain, well myelinated, fast, automatic pathways that activate with minimal effort and feel from the inside, like simply being yourself. Building new pathways requires repetition, specifically, repetition of new behaviors in the presence of the cues that currently trigger the old ones. It is uncomfortable at first not because you are doing it wrong, but because you are doing it right. The discomfort is the neurological experience of a new pathway being carved. It is friction, and friction is the evidence of construction. The important practical implication of this is that change does not require massive, dramatic action. It requires consistent, repeated action, even small action, because the brain responds to frequency more than to intensity. Doing something small every day builds myelin faster than doing something large once a week. The brain is not impressed by grand gestures. It responds to repetition. Why environment beats motivation every time? Motivation is a feeling, and feelings, by their nature, are temporary, variable, and completely unreliable as the primary engine of behavioral change. This is not pessimism. It is an accurate description of how motivation works neurologically. Motivation spikes in response to novelty, to inspiration, to the emotional charge of a new beginning. And then, as reliably as it arrives, it subsides, because the brain habituates to everything, including excitement. The thing that felt electric in week 1 feels ordinary by week 4. This is not failure. This is neuroscience. What does not fluctuate the way motivation does is environment. And environment, the physical arrangement of the spaces you inhabit, the people you are around, the cues that surround you during the hours when decisions get made, is the most powerful and most underused lever in behavioral change. The research on this is consistent and has been for decades. People do not make most of their daily decisions through conscious deliberation. They respond to cues. The food on the counter gets eaten. The phone on the desk gets checked. The running shoes by the door get used more often than the ones in the closet. The book on the pillow gets read. Not because of discipline, because of proximity and design. What this means practically is that the most effective thing you can do for the identity you are building is not to motivate yourself more. It is to redesign your environment so that the behaviors of the new identity are the path of least resistance, and the behaviors of the old identity require friction to access. This is environment design, and it works not by changing your willpower, but by changing what your willpower is required to fight against. Make the new behavior easy. Make the old behavior slightly harder. The brain will follow the path you have paved. The minimum effective dose. One of the most consistent mistakes people make when attempting change is starting too large. The logic feels sound. A big goal requires big action. If you want to become someone who is physically strong, you commit to an hour at the gym every morning. If you want to become someone who writes, you commit to 1,000 words a day. If you want to become someone who meditates, you commit to 30 minutes of silence before the day begins. And then life intervenes, as it always does, and the hour becomes impossible on a Tuesday. And missing Tuesday makes Wednesday feel pointless. And by the following Monday, the entire commitment has collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. The problem is not the goal. The problem is the entry point. Research on habit formation consistently shows that the single most important factor in whether a new behavior sustains is not how impactful it is. It is whether it gets done consistently, without negotiation. A 2-minute version of the behavior, done every single day without exception, builds a stronger neurological foundation than an ambitious version done sporadically. This is the minimum effective dose, not the minimum you are proud of. The minimum that actually gets done. The version so small that the only legitimate excuse for skipping it would be unconsciousness. The reason this works is twofold. First, it builds the neural pathway through consistent repetition regardless of how small the action is. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it builds identity. Every time you do the thing, even the small version, you cast a vote for the person you are becoming. You produce evidence. You add to the file that says, I am someone who does this. An identity, as established in Chapter 2, is what makes behavior sustainable. Start smaller than feels meaningful. Stay consistent longer than feels necessary. Let the size grow naturally from the identity that the consistency is building. The evidence journal. There is one final practice worth discussing in this chapter, and it is both the simplest and the most underestimated tool in the reinvention process. Most people track their failures automatically. The brain's negativity bias ensures it. Missed days, broken commitments, and moments of reverting to the old self are noticed, cataloged, and filed as evidence of inadequacy without any deliberate effort. The wins, the small moments of genuine alignment with the new identity, pass largely unregistered, too small to feel significant, too ordinary to seem worth noting. This asymmetry is not just emotionally discouraging. It is neurologically counterproductive, because the evidence file the brain builds about who you are is built from what gets noticed and repeated. If you only notice the evidence that confirms the old identity, you will keep confirming it, regardless of what is actually changing. The evidence journal corrects this asymmetry deliberately. Once a day, it takes less than 2 minutes. You write down one specific instance in which you behaved in alignment with the identity you are building. Not a grand achievement. A small, real moment of consistency. The day you did the minimum when you did not feel like it. The conversation where you responded the way the new version of you would respond. The decision that cost you something because it was the right decision for the person you are becoming. These entries are not motivational content. They are data. They are the daily accumulation of evidence that the new identity is not just a concept. It is a pattern of behavior that is already, measurably, underway. The brain believes what it repeatedly encounters. Give it something worth believing. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. Design your environment for the identity you are building. Identify the 3 behaviors most central to the identity established in Chapter 2, the person you are becoming. Now look at your physical environment and ask, for each behavior, have I made this easy or hard? Is the cue present or absent? Is the path of least resistance toward this behavior or away from it? Make one concrete change to your environment this week that reduces friction for one of those behaviors. One change. Physical, specific, immediate. Action 2. Identify your daily minimum viable action for the next 30 days for the most important behavioral shift you are making, the one most central to the identity you are building. Define the smallest version of it that still counts. Small enough that there is no legitimate daily excuse. Small enough that even on the worst day, it remains possible. Write it down with this exact framing. No matter what happens, I will do this every day for 30 days. Then do it. Not the ambitious version when you feel good. The minimum version, every day, without exception. Consistency over intensity. Always. Action 3. Start your evidence journal tonight, and every night for the next 30 days, write one sentence. One specific instance, real, small, undeniable, in which you acted in alignment with the person you are becoming. Not an aspiration, not a plan. A thing that actually happened today that the old version of you would not have done or would have done differently. Date each entry. At the end of 30 days, read them in sequence. What you will find is not a list of achievements. It is a portrait of a person who has already begun. Chapter 7. The grief nobody warned you about. There is a stage in every genuine reinvention that almost nobody discusses in the books about reinvention, the podcasts about personal growth, or the conversations people have when they are sharing their transformation stories from the other side. It is not the exciting stage. It is not the stage where the new identity clicks into place and the results start arriving and everything that felt uncertain resolves into clarity and momentum. That stage gets discussed at length. That stage gets the testimonials and the before and after photographs and the highlight posts. The stage nobody discusses is the one that comes before that. The one that arrives, quietly and without warning, somewhere in the middle of genuine change, when the old self is dissolving and the new self is not yet solid. The stage where everything you thought you wanted feels strangely hollow, where the progress you have made produces not elation but a low, inexplicable sadness, where you find yourself, against all reason, being pulled back toward the very life you have been working to leave. This stage has a name. It is grief. And understanding it is the difference between a reinvention that completes and one that quietly collapses just as it starts to work. Why progress sometimes feels like loss. When you begin to genuinely change, not perform change, not plan change, but actually embody a different identity in your daily life, something real is ending. Not just a set of habits or a collection of behaviors. A self. A version of you that has existed long enough to feel like the only version. A way of moving through the world that, whatever its limitations, was known, was practiced, was yours. The ending of that self is a loss. a real one. And loss, regardless of whether what is being lost was good for you, produces grief. The brain does not evaluate whether the ending was wise before generating the emotional response to it. It simply registers something familiar is gone, and it responds accordingly. This is why people who are genuinely progressing in their reinvention often feel, paradoxically, worse at certain points than they did before they started. Not because they are failing, because they are succeeding, and success, at this stage, means something is actually ending. The problem is that most people, when this grief arrives, do not recognize it as grief. They recognize it as doubt. They interpret the sadness as a signal that they were wrong, that the change they were pursuing was not right for them, that the old life was actually fine, that the discomfort is evidence of a mistake rather than evidence of genuine transition. And so they go back, not dramatically, not in a single moment of conscious surrender, gradually, quietly, through a series of small retreats, a reversion to the old habit here, a return to the old dynamic there, until one day they look up and realize they are standing in the same place they started, with a vague sense of having tried and failed at something they cannot quite name. They did not fail at change. They failed to recognize grief as a normal part of it. The unconscious sabotage. There is a related phenomenon worth naming directly, because it operates below the level of conscious awareness and derails more reinventions than any external obstacle. Self-sabotage, the pattern of undermining your own progress at precisely the moment it starts to generate real results, is almost never about fear of failure. It is almost always about fear of success. More specifically, it is about the identity disruption that success produces. When things start working, when the new identity begins to produce visible results, when the gap between who you were and who you are becoming becomes obvious to the people around you, when there is no longer any plausible way to frame what is happening as a temporary experiment, the stakes of the change become real in a way they were not before. Because now it is not a plan. It is a life. And a different life means a different you. And a different you means the old you, with all its familiar comforts, its established relationships, its known limitations and known strengths, is genuinely being left behind. That is frightening in a way that is difficult to articulate and nearly impossible to reason with. And the response to that fear, operating entirely below conscious awareness, is to introduce friction, to pick a fight that disrupts the momentum, to miss the commitment on the day it matters most, to say the thing that reopens the wound that had been healing, to do, in 100 small ways, the thing that brings the familiar back, because the familiar, even when it was painful, did not require you to become someone you have never been before. Recognizing this pattern does not eliminate it, but it changes what you do with it. Instead of interpreting the sabotage as evidence of your fundamental inability to change, you recognize it as a grief response, as the old self making one last, entirely understandable case for its own survival. You can hear that case with compassion. You do not have to agree with it. The emotional archaeology of an ending. Letting an old identity go is not a single decision made once and honored forever. It is a process, iterative, nonlinear, frequently uncomfortable, of excavating what the old identity actually contained and deciding, piece by piece, what to carry forward and what to set down. This is what might be called emotional archaeology. Not therapy, necessarily, though therapy can be part of it. Simply the honest, deliberate practice of looking at who you have been. Not just the limitations, but the genuine qualities, the hard-won capacities, the real strengths that were developed through the experiences that shaped the old self, and giving those things the acknowledgement they deserve before you move past them. Most reinvention advice skips this step entirely. It treats the old self as simply a problem to be solved, a set of bad habits and limiting beliefs to be replaced with better ones. And in doing so, it asks people to abandon not just what was holding them back, but everything that was real and earned and genuinely theirs about who they have been. That is not reinvention. That is erasure. And the psyche resists erasure far more forcefully than it resists evolution. The path through grief is not around the old self. It is through it. It requires sitting with what is ending long enough to genuinely honor it, to acknowledge what it cost to build, what it provided, what was real about it, before setting it down. Not because the old self was right, because it was yours, because you lived inside it, because the person who built it, under the circumstances that shaped it, did the best they could with what they had. That person deserves a proper farewell, not a eulogy of regret, an honest acknowledgement of ending, given with the same respect you would offer anything that served its purpose and has now been outgrown. Carrying what is worth carrying. There is one more thing this chapter needs to say, and it may be the most important. Not everything in the old identity needs to be left behind. In fact, the impulse to abandon everything, to treat the reinvention as a complete break from the past, is itself a grief response. A way of managing the pain of transition by making it absolute, by drawing a clean line that does not actually exist. The old you was not only limitations. It was also resilience, capacity, hard-earned understanding, and qualities developed through experiences that were genuinely difficult. The loyalty you developed through hardship. The empathy you built through your own pain. The discipline you forged through years of showing up when it was inconvenient. The humor that carried you through what could have broken you. These things belong in the next chapter. They are not the old identity. They are the best of it, distilled and carried forward into a self that is larger than what contained them before. Grief, when it is done honestly, does not leave you empty. It leaves you clear. Clear about what was worth the years you gave it. Clear about what was never really you. Clear about what you are taking with you and what you are finally, with gratitude and without apology, setting down. That clarity is not the end of the reinvention, but it is the end of the part that hurts the most. And after it, the next chapter does not feel like an escape from who you were. It feels like the fullest expression of who you have always, underneath everything, been becoming. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. Write a farewell letter to the version of you that is ending, not a letter of criticism, not a list of everything that was wrong with the old self. A genuine farewell, written with honesty and without sentimentality, to the version of you that carried you to this point. Acknowledge what it cost to build that self. Acknowledge what it provided, what it protected you from, what it allowed you to survive or achieve. Then, clearly and with finality, say goodbye to the parts of it that no longer belong in the next chapter. This letter is not for anyone else. It is the psyche's way of completing what the mind has already decided. Action 2. Identify specifically what you are afraid to lose in this transition. Underneath every reinvention is a specific fear of loss. Not vague anxiety, but a concrete thing that the old identity provided and that the new one has not yet proven it can replace. Safety, belonging, certainty, the approval of specific people, a familiar sense of who you are in a room. Name it specifically, not as a weakness, but as information. Because the thing you are most afraid to lose is almost always the thing the old identity was organized around protecting. An understanding that tells you exactly where the deepest work of this transition needs to happen. Action 3. Name one quality from your old identity genuinely worth carrying forward. Look at who you have been, honestly, without the instinct to either defend it entirely or dismiss it entirely, and find one quality that is real, earned, and belongs in the next chapter. Not a consolation prize, a genuine strength, developed through genuine experience, that the next version of you would be diminished without. Name it. Write it down as something you are choosing to bring forward deliberately, not as baggage, but as foundation. The next version of you is not built from nothing. It is built from the best of what the last version learned. Chapter 8. The new version of you begins before you feel ready. Here is something that is true of every single person who has ever genuinely changed. They were not ready. Not one of them. Not the person who left the career that was slowly hollowing them out. Not the person who ended the relationship that had become a performance of connection rather than the real thing. Not the person who started the business, moved to the unfamiliar city, began the creative work they had been postponing for a decade, had the conversation they had been avoiding for years. Not one of them did it from a place of complete readiness, full confidence, and perfect circumstances. They did it afraid. They did it with incomplete information. They did it while the voice in the background was still making a reasonable case for waiting. They did it in the middle of ordinary life, without a dramatic catalyst, without a sign that it was definitively the right moment. They simply decided, at some point, in some quiet or not so quiet way, that waiting for ready was its own kind of decision, and that the life on the other side of the wait was not going to hold indefinitely. Readiness, it turns out, is not a prerequisite for beginning. It is a result of it. The architecture of waiting. Waiting for the right moment is the most sophisticated form of avoidance most people ever develop. It is sophisticated because it does not feel like avoidance. It feels like wisdom. It feels like patience, like prudence, like the responsible approach of someone who takes their decisions seriously and does not act impulsively. And sometimes it is those things. Timing is real. Preparation is real. There are genuinely better and worse moments to make certain kinds of moves. But most of the time, if you are honest with yourself about the specific thing you have been waiting on, the waiting is not strategic. It is structural. It is built into the way you approach the idea of change itself, as something that requires a set of conditions to be met before it can legitimately begin. More money saved, more clarity about the direction, more confidence in the outcome, more evidence that the timing is right, more certainty that it will work. These conditions are not unreasonable. That is what makes them so effective as delay mechanisms. They are just reasonable enough to justify, just concrete enough to feel like real criteria, and just perpetually unmet enough to ensure the beginning never quite arrives. Because here is what the waiting does not account for. The conditions you are waiting for are, in most cases, produced by beginning, not prerequisites to it. Confidence does not arrive before the action. It arrives through it. Clarity does not precede the move. It emerges from the movement. The certainty you are waiting to feel is not something that will be delivered to you before you start. It is something you will build, incrementally, from the evidence generated by starting. Waiting for ready is, in the most precise sense, waiting for something that the waiting itself prevents from arriving. The one decision. There is a distinction, quiet, undramatic, but absolute, between people who change and people who spend their lives intending to. It is not a difference in desire. The people who stay the same want to change, often desperately. They read the books, they feel the resonance, they recognize themselves in the descriptions, they feel the genuine pull of a different life. The desire is real. It is not a difference in knowledge. After a certain point, more information does not produce more change. The people who are not stuck because they do not understand what needs to happen. Most of them understand it with considerable sophistication. Understanding and doing are not the same process, and more of the first does not automatically produce the second. The difference is a decision. A specific kind of decision that is less about what you are going to do and more about who you are going to be, starting now, before the results, before the confirmation, before the feeling of readiness arrives to give you permission. It is the decision to stop treating the new identity as a destination and start treating it as a current address. Not someday, I will be someone who does this. I am someone who does this. And today is one of the days I do it. That shift, from future aspiration to present identity, is not semantic. It is the actual mechanism of change. Because the person who is becoming does not negotiate with themselves about whether today is a good day for the minimum action. The person who is becoming does not wait to feel like the new identity before acting from it. The person who is becoming acts first and lets the feeling follow, which it does, reliably, for anyone who sustains the behavior long enough to accumulate evidence. The question this book has been building toward is not, are you ready to change? The question is, are you willing to begin before you are? What this book cannot do. There is something honest that needs to be said here, at the end, because this book has asked a great deal of you, in terms of reflection, self-examination, and the particular kind of discomfort that comes from looking at your own life clearly. This book can show you the mechanism. It can name what is happening and why. It can give you the framework, the language, the actions, the understanding of identity and neuroscience and grief and social pressure that makes the process of reinvention less mysterious and more navigable. What it cannot do is make the decision for you. Not because the decision is complicated. It is actually one of the simplest decisions a person can make. It is just not easy. Simple and easy are not the same thing. And this particular decision, to stop inhabiting the version of yourself you have outgrown and begin building the version that is waiting, is as simple as any decision gets and as difficult as most people will ever face. Because it requires you to act without the guarantee, to move without the certainty, to become someone new in the ordinary circumstances of an ordinary day, without a dramatic turning point to later, without an external catalyst to credit, without anyone else making it necessary. Just you, deciding, quietly, completely, and without waiting for permission from anyone, including the version of yourself that is afraid. The direct challenge. You have read this far. That means something. It means the discomfort was familiar enough to recognize. The ideas were resonant enough to stay with. The version of yourself described in these pages was close enough to the truth to be worth sitting with. But resonance is not change. Recognition is not change. Even genuine intention, the kind that feels real and lasting in the moment of reading, is not change. Change is Tuesday morning when you do not feel like it. Change is the conversation you have been postponing for 6 months that you finally have this week. Change is the minimum action on the day everything in you wants to negotiate. Change is the identity statement you wrote in Chapter 2 being acted on, right now, not because conditions are perfect, but because you have decided that you are already that person, and this is simply what that person does. The version of you that has been the same for too long is not your enemy. It is not a failure. It is a beginning that has been waiting, sometimes for years, for you to finally stop managing it and start moving past it. Every chapter in this book has been pointing at the same thing from a different angle. The life you want is not on the other side of a dramatic transformation. It is on the other side of a decision made today, acted on tomorrow, and repeated until it becomes the new familiar. You have everything you need. You have had it for longer than you know. Begin. 3 actions to take after this chapter. Action 1. Write your reinvention statement, 1 paragraph. Present tense. First person. Specific enough to be unambiguous, honest enough to be real. Not who you hope to become, who you are becoming. Now, in this chapter of your life, regardless of what the results look like yet, write it as a statement of current identity, not future aspiration. Include what you value, how you operate, what you no longer tolerate, and what you are building. Read it every morning for 30 days, not as an affirmation, but as a reminder of the decision you have already made. Action 2. Set your 90-day identity milestone. Identify one specific, measurable marker that will serve as evidence, 90 days from today, that the reinvention is real and underway. Not a finished product, a proof of direction. Something concrete enough that on day 90 you can look at it and say, the person I was a year ago would not have done this. Make it ambitious enough to require genuine growth and specific enough to be undeniable. Write the date. Write the marker. Treat it as a commitment made to yourself with the same seriousness you would bring to a commitment made to someone you deeply respect. Action 3. Commit to the one daily non-negotiable from everything in this book, the identity you defined, the environment you designed, the minimum viable action you identified, the evidence you have begun collecting. Name the single daily action that the new version of you would never skip. Not the most impressive action, the most foundational one. The one that, if done consistently for the next year, makes everything else more possible. Write it down, not as a goal, as a commitment, as the one thing that, regardless of how the day goes, regardless of how you feel, regardless of what the old voice says, gets done. Because you are not the person you used to be. And this is what the person you are becoming does. This is not the end of the book. This is the beginning of the work. Before you close this book, the feeling you have right now, the clarity, the recognition, the sense that something needs to move, is real. Honor it by doing something with it before it fades. Because it will fade. That is not weakness. That is how feelings work. The work was never in the reading. It was always in the actions. You are not starting over. Every version of yourself you have ever been, every chapter you have lived through, every identity you have outgrown, all of it is the foundation you are building from. You are not beginning from nothing. You are beginning from everything. The new version of you does not need perfect conditions. It does not need more time, more clarity, or more confidence. It needs one decision, made today, acted on tomorrow, repeated until it becomes the new familiar. Stop waiting. Begin. One last thing. You now have 8 chapters and 24 action steps. Everything you need to break free from the version of yourself that has been holding you back is already in your hands. But knowing and doing are 2 different things. So we built you a journal, a complete, structured guide designed to take everything you just read and turn it into real action. Your identity statement, your this no longer fits list, your internal narrative audit, your 90-day milestone, your daily non-negotiable, all in one place. Not a summary. A transformation guide you work through at your own pace, in your own handwriting, on your own terms. The link is in the description. Reinvention is closer than you think. The journal is how you prove it.